The bright lights of the Family Feud studio had never felt so harsh, so unforgiving. 16-year-old Sarah Williams stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, her jaw clenched in the way that had become second nature when waves of pain crashed over her body like invisible tsunamis. To everyone watching, Sarah looked like a typical teenager. Blonde hair, athletic build, the kind of healthy appearance that made adults assume she had the world at her fingertips. They had no idea that every moment of standing upright was a battle, that every smile was carefully constructed to hide agony that never ever stopped. Sarah had been living with fibromyalgia for 3 years, ever since a car accident when she was 13 had triggered a cascade of neurological changes that doctors still didn't fully understand. The accident itself had been minor, a fender bender in a grocery store parking lot that had left everyone else uninjured. But for Sarah, it had been the beginning of a nightmare that masqueraded as normal teenage life. Fibromyalgia was called the invisible illness for a reason. There were no casts, no obvious injuries, no external signs that Sarah's nervous system had become a constant source of pain signals that fired randomly throughout her body. Some days, the lightest touch felt like being stabbed with hot needles. Other days, her muscles ached as if she had run a marathon while someone beat her with hammers. And every day, people who couldn't see her pain treated her like she was making it up. The Williams family had driven 6 hours from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles for this taping, not because they needed the money, though they certainly did after years of medical bills, but because Sarah's mother, Jennifer Williams, believed her daughter needed to remember what it felt like to be seen as more than a collection of symptoms. Sarah had been an honor student and star soccer player before the accident. Now she struggled to attend school regularly, had given up sports entirely, and spent most of her time managing pain that most people her age couldn't imagine. The journey to the Family Feud studio had been excruciating for Sarah. The long car ride had triggered a flare-up that left her feeling like her skin was on fire, her joints filled with broken glass. She had taken her pain medication before the taping, but the pills only took the edge off the worst moments. They never made the pain disappear entirely. During the pre-show preparations, Sarah had been quiet and focused, conserving her energy for the moments when she would need to perform. The production staff had been charmed by the Williams family's obvious love for each other, by Sarah's articulate responses during interviews, by what appeared to be a typical American family pursuing a fun television experience. What they hadn't seen were the careful preparations Sarah had made just to appear normal for a few hours. The heating pad she had used in the hotel room that morning. The way she had practiced standing and walking without wincing. The mental preparation she did before every public appearance, building walls around her pain so that others wouldn't have to witness her reality. The game had started well enough. The Williams family was competing against the Rodriguez family from Texas, and both sides were playing with good energy and humor. Sarah's father had provided solid answers about household items and family traditions. Her older brother had scored well with responses about things teenagers do. Sarah had been positioned at the end of the family podium where she could participate if she felt up to it, but wouldn't be pressured to perform if her pain became unmanageable. For the first 3 rounds, Sarah had managed to maintain her facade. She had cheered enthusiastically for her family's correct answers, had smiled at Steve Harvey's jokes, had looked for all the world like a healthy, happy teenager, enjoying a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But by the 4th round, the combination of standing under hot studio lights, the adrenaline of the game, and the constant effort required to appear normal had pushed her body past its breaking point. The category was Things People Judge You For, and it was Sarah's turn at the buzzer. Steve Harvey had approached with his usual warmth and humor, ready to engage with the youngest adult member of the Williams family. "All right, Sarah," Steve had said, his voice carrying its familiar encouragement. "Things people judge you for. What do you think people judge other people for?" Sarah had looked at Steve, then at the board, then back at Steve with an expression that seemed to carry weight far beyond her 16 years. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, but there was something in her tone that made the studio audience pay closer attention. "Being in pain nobody can see," Sarah had said quietly. The response had hung in the air for a moment. It wasn't the kind of answer typically heard on Family Feud. Not funny, not obvious, not the sort of thing that made for easy television. Steve had paused, his entertainer's instincts telling him that something significant had just happened. "Being in pain nobody can see," Steve had repeated slowly, his voice thoughtful. "That's a very specific answer. Can you tell me more about that?" Sarah had opened her mouth to respond, but instead of words, what came out was a small gasp of pain. The combination of standing under the lights, the stress of being on television, and the emotional weight of her answer had triggered what people with fibromyalgia called a flare-up, a sudden intensification of pain that could be completely debilitating. Sarah's legs had buckled without warning. One moment she was standing at the podium, and the next she was collapsing toward the floor, her face contorting with agony as every nerve in her body seemed to catch fire simultaneously. The audience had gasped, thinking she had simply fainted or lost her balance, but Sarah's family had immediately recognized what was happening. Steve Harvey had moved faster than anyone expected, dropping his cards and reaching Sarah before she hit the ground. He had caught her under her arms and helped lower her gently to the studio floor, his face immediately shifting from confusion to concern as he realized this wasn't a simple stumble. "Sarah, what's happening?" Steve had asked, his voice stripped of all performance, all entertainment value. This was just a man trying to help a young woman in distress. "Pain," Sarah had managed to whisper through gritted teeth, her body curled in on itself as waves of agony crashed over her. "It's everywhere. I can't make it stop." Steve had knelt beside Sarah on the studio floor, his expensive suit forgotten as he focused entirely on the teenager who was clearly experiencing something far beyond ordinary discomfort. The cameras had kept rolling, but everyone in the studio had understood that they were no longer watching a game show. They were witnessing something real and raw and heartbreaking. "Where does it hurt?" Steve had asked gently. "Everywhere," Sarah had replied, tears streaming down her face. "My skin, my muscles, my bones. It feels like I'm being stabbed and burned and crushed all at the same time, and nobody believes me because they can't see it." The admission had hit the studio like a physical blow. Sarah's mother had rushed from the family podium to her daughter's side, her own tears flowing as she watched her child experience the kind of pain that no parent should have to witness helplessly. Steve had looked up at the production team, then back down at Sarah, and in that moment he had made a decision that would define not just that episode, but his understanding of what it meant to show up for someone in their darkest moment. "Sarah," he had said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to know something. I believe you. I believe that you're in pain, I believe that it's real, and I believe that it's not your fault." Sarah had looked at him through her tears with an expression of such relief that it was almost painful to witness. For years she had been told by well-meaning adults that she was too young to be in real pain, that it was probably just stress, that she should try to be more positive. Hearing someone in authority simply acknowledge her reality had been like receiving permission to stop pretending she was okay. "The pain you're feeling," Steve had continued, "it doesn't have to be visible to be real, it doesn't have to make sense to other people to be valid. And you don't have to prove it to anyone for it to matter." Steve had turned to address the studio audience, his voice carrying an authority that commanded absolute attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he had announced, "this young lady is dealing with something that millions of people face every day. Pain that can't be seen from the outside, but is very real on the inside. Sarah has fibromyalgia, a condition that causes chronic pain throughout her body. Just because you can't see someone's pain doesn't mean it isn't there." He had looked back down at Sarah, who was still curled on the studio floor but whose breathing had begun to slow as the worst of the flare-up started to pass. "Sarah, I want you to know that standing on this stage, playing this game, being here with your family, that took incredible courage. Most people have no idea how much strength it takes to appear normal when your body is fighting you every single day." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping, the one that had become part of his television identity. But instead of draping it over Sarah's shoulders as he had done with other contestants, he had folded it carefully and placed it under her head as a makeshift pillow. "This jacket has been with me through every show," Steve had said. "It's been my armor when I needed to be strong, my comfort when things got difficult. Today it's here to remind you that you don't have to be strong all by yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people see when you're hurting." Sarah had looked up at Steve from her position on the floor, and for the first time in years she had felt truly seen, not judged, not doubted, not dismissed, but genuinely understood by someone who mattered. "I'm tired of pretending I'm okay," Sarah had whispered. "I'm tired of people thinking I'm lazy or dramatic. I'm tired of feeling like I have to prove I'm really sick." "Then stop," Steve had said simply. "Stop pretending. Stop proving. Start living your truth, even when other people don't understand it." The studio had fallen completely silent as Sarah had slowly, carefully pushed herself up to a sitting position. Steve had helped support her, making sure she didn't strain herself further. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, clearer, filled with something that sounded like liberation. "I have fibromyalgia," Sarah had announced to the studio, her voice carrying across the space with surprising power. "I'm 16 years old, and I live with chronic pain every single day. Some days are better than others. Today is not one of the better days. But I'm here anyway, because my family loves me, and because I refuse to let this condition define everything I do." The audience had erupted in applause, not the typical game show cheering, but something deeper, something that recognized courage when they saw it. People had stood, some wiping away tears, all of them understanding that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. But Steve hadn't been finished. He had helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight as she found her balance again. "Sarah," he had said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. When people judge you for being in pain they can't see, what do you wish they understood?" Sarah had thought for a moment, leaning against Steve for support, drawing strength from his presence and his genuine interest in her answer. "I wish they understood that invisible doesn't mean imaginary," she had said. "I wish they knew that I would give anything to be the person I was before this started. I wish they realized that when I say I can't do something, it's not because I don't want to, it's because my body won't let me. And I wish they knew that believing someone when they tell you they're hurting is one of the kindest things you can do." Steve had nodded, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Sarah Williams, ladies and gentlemen," he had announced to the studio. "A young woman who is teaching all of us that strength comes in many forms, that courage isn't always loud, and that some of the biggest battles are fought by people who look perfectly fine from the outside." The game had continued, but it had been transformed. Both families had played not for themselves but for Sarah, celebrating every point as if it were a victory over invisible pain, a triumph of spirit over physical limitation. Sarah had managed to participate in one more round, and when she provided the winning answer, family support for things that help you get through difficult times, the celebration had been unlike anything in Family Feud history. The episode had ended with Sarah still wearing Steve's jacket draped over her shoulders, standing with her family as confetti fell around them. But the real victory had been in the conversation that had started, in the awareness that had been raised, in the validation that had been given to millions of people watching who lived with invisible illnesses. After the cameras stopped rolling, Steve had spent time talking with Sarah and her family, learning more about fibromyalgia, connecting them with resources and support networks. He had promised to stay in touch, to continue using his platform to raise awareness about invisible disabilities. The episode had aired 2 months later and had sparked a national conversation about chronic pain, invisible illnesses, and the importance of believing people when they tell you they're suffering. Medical professionals had praised the segment for its accurate representation of fibromyalgia. Support groups had used it as an educational tool. Most importantly, young people with chronic illnesses had finally seen themselves represented on mainstream television. Sarah had kept Steve's jacket, but more than that, she had kept the confidence it represented. She had learned that her pain didn't have to be hidden, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that living with a chronic illness required a different kind of strength, but it was still strength nonetheless. She had started a blog about living with fibromyalgia as a teenager, sharing both the challenges and the victories, helping other young people feel less alone in their struggles. She had become an advocate for invisible illness awareness, speaking at schools and medical conferences about the importance of believing and supporting people whose disabilities aren't immediately apparent. Steve Harvey had learned something profound about the nature of suffering and resilience. He had discovered that some of the strongest people are those who wake up every day and choose to keep going despite pain that never stops, despite judgments from people who don't understand, despite a world that often seems designed for people whose bodies work differently than theirs. The jacket that Steve had given Sarah became a symbol not just of support, but of visibility, a reminder that being seen and believed is sometimes the most powerful medicine of all. Sarah wore it to medical appointments, to school presentations, to moments when she needed to remember that her pain was real, valid, and deserving of recognition. Years later, Sarah would become a nurse, specializing in pain management, dedicating her career to helping other people navigate the complex intersection of physical suffering and social judgment. She would often tell her patients about the day a game show host knelt beside her on a studio floor and reminded her that invisible pain is still real pain, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply believe them when they tell you they're hurting. Because that's what compassion looks like when it chooses to see beyond appearances. That's what validation sounds like when it refuses to demand proof of suffering. And that's what happens when someone's invisible pain finally becomes visible, not because the pain itself changed, but because someone with influence decided that all pain deserves to be acknowledged, respected, and treated with the dignity that every human being deserves. Sarah Williams had spent years hiding her pain to make other people comfortable. But after that day on Family Feud, she had learned that the most powerful thing she could do was stop hiding, start speaking, and trust that the right people would listen. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let your invisible struggles become visible. And sometimes that visibility comes wrapped in a game show host's jacket and delivered with the simple message that your pain is real, your struggle matters, and you are not alone.